everybody, it's Susan. Welcome to my channel, Susan Diamond Paint. February 14th devotional, Psalms 103:12. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. Chapter 12. Neil had planned to do a great deal of reading in the Forester's Grove that summer, but he did not go over so often as he had intended. The frequent appearance of Ivy Peters about the place irritated him. Ivy visited his new wheat fields on the bottom land very often, and he always took the old path that led from what was once the marsh up the steep bank and through the grove. He was likely to appear at any hour, his trousers stuffed into his top boots, tramping along between the rows of trees with an air of proprietorship. He shut the gate behind the house with a slam and went whistling through the yard. Often he stopped at the kitchen door to call out some pleasantry to Mrs. Forrester. This annoyed Neil, for at that hour of the morning, when she was doing her housework, Mrs. Forrester was not dressed to receive her inferiors. It was one thing to greet the president of Colorado and Utah, but it was another to chatter with a coarse-grained fellow like Ivy Peters in her wrapper and slippers, her sleeves rolled up and her throat bare to his cool, impudent eyes. Sometimes Ivy strode through the rose plot where Captain Forrester was sitting in the sun, went by without looking at him as if there were no one there. If he spoke to the captain at all, he did so as if he were addressing someone incapable of understanding anything. "Hello, Captain. Ain't afraid the sun will spoil your complexion?" Or, "Well, Captain, you have to get the prayer meetings to take this rain up in question. The drought's damn bad for my wheat." One morning, as Neil was coming up through the grove, he heard laughter by the gate, and there he saw Ivy, with his gun, talking to Mrs. Forrester. She was bareheaded, her skirts blowing in the wind, her arm through the handle of the big tin bucket that rested on the fence beside her. Ivy stood with his hat on his head, but there was in his attitude that unmistakable something which shows that a man is trying to make himself agreeable to a woman. He was telling her a funny story, probably an improper one, for it brought out her naughtiest laugh, with something nervous and excited in it, as if he were going too far. At the end of his story, Ivy broke into his famous farmhand guffaw. Mrs. Forrester shook her finger at him, and catching up to her pail, ran back into the house. She bent a little with its weight, but Ivy made no offer to carry it for her. He let her trip away with it as if she were a kitchen maid, and that were her business. Neil emerged from the grove and stopped where the captain sat in the garden. "Good morning, Captain Forrester. Was that Ivy Peters who just went through here? That fellow hasn't the manners of a pig," he blurted out. The captain pointed to Mrs. Forrester's empty chair. "Sit down, Neil. Sit down." He drew his handkerchief from his pocket and began to polish his glasses. "No," he said quietly, "he ain't overly polite." More than if he had complained bitterly, the guarded admission made one feel how much he had been hurt and offended by Ivy's rudeness. There was something very sad in his voice and helpless. From his equals, respect had always come to him as his due. From fellows like Ivy, he had been able to command it, to order them off his place or dismiss them from his employ. Neil sat down and smoked a cigar with him. They had a long talk about the building of the Black Hills branch of the Burlington. In Boston last winter, Neil had met an old mine owner who was living in Deadwood when the railroad first came in. When Neil asked him if he had known Daniel Forrester, the gentleman said, "Forrester, was he the one with the beautiful wife?" "You must tell her," said the captain, stroking the warm surface of his sundial. "Yes, indeed, you must tell Mrs. Forrester." One night in the first week of July, a night of glorious moonlight, Neil found himself unable to read or to stay indoors at all. He walked aimlessly down the wide, empty street and crossed the first creek by the footbridge. The wide, ripe fields, the whole country seemed like a sleeping garden. One tried the dusty road softly, not to disturb the deep slumber of the world. In the Forrester lane, the sweet clover hung heavy. It had always grown tall and green here since Neil could remember. The captain would never let it be cut until the weeds were mowed in the fall. The black, plume-like shadows of the poplars fell across the lane and over Ivy Peters' wheat fields. As he walked on, Neil saw a white figure standing on the bridge over the second creek, motionless in the clear moonlight. He hurried forward. Mrs. Forrester was looking down at the water where it flowed bright over the pebbles. He came up beside her. The captain is asleep? Oh, yes, long ago. He sleeps well, thank heaven. After I took him, I have nothing more to worry about. While they were standing there talking in low voices, they heard a heavy door slam on the hill. Mrs. Forrester started and looked back over her shoulder. A man emerged from the shadow of the house and came striding down the driveway. Ivy Peters stepped upon the bridge. Good evening, he said to Mrs. Forrester, neither calling her by name nor removing his hat. I see you have company. I have just been up looking at the old barn to see if the stalls are fit to put the horses in there tomorrow. I'm going to start cutting wheat in the morning, and we'll have to put the horses in your stable at noon. We'll lose time taking them back to town. Why, certainly, the horses can go in our barn. I'm sure Mr. Forrester will have no objection. She spoke as if he had asked her permission. Oh, Ivy shrugged. The men will begin down here at 6 o'clock. I won't get over till about 10, and I have to meet a client in my office at 3. Maybe you could give me some lunch to save time. His impudence made her smile. Very well, then. I invite you to lunch. We lunch at 1. Thanks, it'll help me out. As if he had forgotten himself, he lifted his hat and went down the lane swinging it in his hand. Neil stood looking after him. Why do you allow him to speak to you like that, Mrs. Forrester? If you'll let me, I'll give him a beating and teach him how to speak to you. No, Neil. Remember, we have to get along with Ivy Peters. We simply have to. There was a note of anxiety in her voice, and she caught his arm. You don't have to take anything from him or to stand his bad manners. Anyone else would pay you as much for the land as he does. But he has a lease for 5 years, and he can make it very disagreeable for us, don't you see? Besides, she spoke hurriedly, there's more than that. He's invested a little money for me in Wyoming in land. He gets splendid land from the Indians some way for next to nothing. Don't tell your uncle, I've no doubt it's crooked. But the judge is like Mr. Forrester. His methods don't work nowadays. He will never get us out of debt, dear man. He can't get himself out. Ivy Peters is terribly smart, you know. He owns half the town already. Not quite, said Neil grimly. He's got a hold of a good deal of property. He'll take advantage of anybody's necessity. You know he's utterly unscrupulous, don't you? Why didn't you let Mr. Dalzell or some of your other friends invest your money for you? Oh, it was too little. Only a few $100 I've saved in on housekeeping. They would put it into something safe at 6%. I know you don't like Ivy, and he knows it. He's always at his worst before you. He's not as bad as his face, for instance. She laughed nervously. He honestly wants to help us out of the hole we're in. Coming and going all the time as he does, he sees everything, and I really think he hates to have me work so hard. Next time you have anything to invest, you let me take it to Mr. Dalzell and explain. I promise to do it as well by you as Ivy Peters can. Mrs. Forrester took his arm and drew him into the lane. But my dear boy, you know nothing about these business schemes. You're not clever that way. It's one of the things I love you for. I don't admire people who cheat Indians. Indeed, I don't. She shook her head vehemently. Mrs. Forrester, rascality isn't the only thing that succeeds in business. It succeeds faster than anything else, though, she murmured absently. They walked as far as the end of the lane and turned back again. Mrs. Forrester's hand tightened on his arm. She began speaking abruptly. You see, 2 years, 3 years, more of this, and I still could go back to California and live again. But after that, perhaps people think I've settled down to grow old gracefully, but I've not. I feel such a power to live in me, Neil. Her slender fingers gripped his wrist. It's grown by being held back. Last winter I was with the Dalzells at Glenwood Springs for the 3 weeks. I owe that to Ivy Peters. He looked after things here, and his sister kept house for Mr. Forrester. And I was surprised at myself. I could dance all night and not feel tired. I could ride horseback all day and be ready for a dinner party in the evening. I had no clothes, of course. Old evening dresses with yards and yards of satin velvet in them that Mrs. Dalzell's sewing woman made over. But I looked well enough. Yes, I did. I always know how I'm looking and how I looked well enough. The men thought so. I looked happier than any woman there. They were nearly all younger, much, but they seemed dull, bored to death. After a glass or two of champagne, they went to sleep and had nothing to say. I always look better after the first glass. It gives me a little color, and it's the only thing that does. I accepted Dalzell's invitation with a purpose. I wanted to see whether I had anything left worth saving, and I have, I tell you. You would hardly believe it. I could hardly believe it, but I still have. By this time they reached the bridge, a bare white floor in the moonlight. Mrs. Forrester had been quickening her pace all the while. So that's what I'm struggling for, to get out of this hole. She looked about as if she had fallen into a deep well. Out of it. When I'm alone here for months together, I plan and plot. If it weren't for that, As Neil walked back to his room from behind the law offices, he felt frightened for her. When women began to talk about still feeling young, didn't it mean that something had broken? 2 or 3 years, she had said. He shivered. Only yesterday, old Dr. Denison had proudly told him that Captain Foster might live to a dozen. We are keeping his general health up remarkably, and he was originally a man of iron. What hope was there for her? He could still feel her hand upon his arm, and she urged him faster and faster up the lane. Chapter 13. The weather was dry and intensely hot for several weeks, and then at the end of July, thunderstorms and torrential rains broke upon the Sweetwater Valley. The river burst out of its banks, all the creeks were up, and the stubble of Ivy Peters' wheat fields lay under water. A wide lake and 2 rushing creeks now separated the Foresters from the town. Ben Keezer rode over to them every day to do the chores and to take them their mail. One evening, Ben, with his slicker and leather mailbag, had just come out of the post office and was preparing to mount his horse when Neil Herbert stopped him to ask in a low voice whether he had got the Denver paper. "Oh, yes, I always wait for the papers. She likes to have them to read for an evening. Guess it's pretty lonesome over there." He swung into his saddle and splashed off. Neil walked slowly around the hotel for dinner. He had found something very disconcerting in the Denver paper. Frank Ellinger's picture on the society page, along with Constance Ogden's. They had been married yesterday at Colorado Springs and were stopping at the Antlers. After supper, Neil put his rubber coat and started for the Foresters. When he reached the first creek, he found that the footbridge had been washed out from the far bank and laid obliquely in the stream, battered by the yellow current that might at any moment carry it away. One could not cross the ford without a horse. He looked resolutely across the submerged bottom lands. The house was dark, no lights in the parlor windows. The rain was beginning to fall again. Perhaps she had rather be alone tonight. He would go over tomorrow. He went back to the law office and tried to make himself comfortable, though the place was in distracting disorder. The continued rain had set one of the chimneys leaking, had brought down streams of soot and black water, and flooded the stove and the judge's once handsome Brussels carpet. The tenor had been there all afternoon trying to find what was the matter with the flue, cutting a new sheet iron drawer to fit under the stovepipe, but at 6 o'clock he had gone away, leaving tools and sheets of metal lying about. The rooms were damp and cold. Neil put on a heavy sweater since he could not have a fire, lit the big coal oil lamp, and sat down with a book. When at last he looked at his watch, it was nearly midnight, and he had been reading 3 hours. He would have another pipe and go to bed. He had scarcely lit it when he heard quick hurrying footsteps on the echoing corridor outside. He got to the door in an instant and was there to open it before Mrs. Forster had time to knock. He caught her by the arm and pulled her in. Everything but her wet white face was hidden by a black rubber hat and a coat that was much too big for her. Streams of water trickled from the coat, and when she opened it, he saw that she was drenched to the waist. Her black dress clung in a muddy pulp about her. "Mrs. Forster," he cried, "you can't have crossed the creek. It's up to a horse's belly in the ford." "I came over the bridge, what's left of it. It shook under me, but I'm not heavy." She threw off her hat and wiped the water from her face with her hands. "Why didn't you ask Ben to bring you over on his horse? Here, please swallow this." She pushed his hand aside. "Wait, afterwards, Ben? I didn't think until after he was gone. It was the telephone I want, long distance. Get me Colorado Springs, the Antlers, quick." Then Neil noticed that she smelled strong of spirits. It steamed above the smell of rubber and creek mud and wet cloth. She snatched at the desk telephone, but he gently took it from her. "I'll get them for you, but you're in no condition to talk now. You're out of breath. Do you really want to talk tonight? You know Mrs. Beasley will hear every word you say." Mrs. Beasley was the Sweetwater Central and an indefatigable reporter of everything went over the wires. Mrs. Forster, sitting in his uncle's desk chair, tapped the carpet with the toe of her rubber boot. "Do hurry, please," she said in that polite warning tone of which even Ivy Peters was afraid. Neil aroused the sleepy Central and put in the call. She asked whom you wished to speak to. "Frank Ellinger. Say Judge Pomeroy's office wishes to speak to him." Neil began soothing Mrs. Beasley at the other end. "No, not the management, Mrs. Beasley, one of the guests. Frank Ellinger." He spelled the name. "Yes, Judge Pomeroy's office wants to talk to him. I'll be right here. As soon as you can, please." He put down the instrument. "I'd rather, publish anything in the town paper than to telephone it through Mrs. Beasley." Mrs. Forster paid no heed to him, did not look at him, sat staring at the wall. I can't see why you didn't call me up and ask me to bring a horse over for you if you felt you must get a long-distance telephone tonight. Yes, I didn't think of it. I only knew I had to get over here, and I was afraid something might stop me." She was watching the telephone as if it were alive. Her eyes were shrunk to hard points, her brows drawn together at an acute angle, kept twitching in the frown which held them, the singular frown of one overcome by alcohol or fatigue, who is holding on to consciousness by the strength of a single purpose. Her blue lips, the black shadows under her eyes, made her look as if some poison were working in her body. They waited and waited. Neil understood that she didn't wish him to talk. Her mind was struggling with something. With every blink of her lashes, she seemed to face it anew. Presently she rose, as if she could bear the suspense no longer, and went over to the window and leaned against it. "Did you leave Captain Forster alone?" Neil asked suddenly. "Yes, nothing will happen over there. Nothing ever does happen," she answered, wildly wringing her hands. The telephone buzzed. Mrs. Forster darted toward the desk, but Neil lifted the instrument in his left hand and barred her away with his right. "Try to be calm, Mrs. Forster. When I get Ellinger, I will let you talk to him, and Spencer will hear every word you say. Remember." After some exchanges with the Colorado office, he pointed her to the chair. "Sit down and I'll give it to you. He is on the wire." He did not dare leave her alone, though it was awkward enough to be a listener. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the desk where she was sitting. "Is that you, Frank? This is Marion. I won't keep you a moment. You were asleep so early? That's not like you. You reformed already, haven't you? That's what marriage does, they say. No, I wasn't altogether surprised. You might have taken me into your confidence, though. Haven't I deserved it?" A long listening pause. Neil still stupidly at the dark window. He had steeled his nerves for the wild reproaches. The voice he heard behind him was her most charming, playful, affectionate, intimate, with a thrill of pleasant excitement that warned its slightly formality and burned through the commonplace words like color in an opal. He simply held his breath while she fluttered on. "Where shall you go for your honeymoon?" "Oh, I'm very sorry. So soon? You must take good care of her. Give her my love. I shouldn't think California at this time of year might be right." It went on like this for some minutes. The voice, it seemed to Neil, was that of a woman, young, beautiful, happy, warm, and at her ease, sitting in her own drawing room and talking on a stormy night to a dear friend far away. "Oh, unusually well for me. Stop and see for yourself. You'll be going to Omaha on business next week before California. Oh, yes, you will. Stop off between trains. You know how welcome you always are." A long pause. An exclamation from Mrs. Forster made Neil turn sharply round. Now it was coming. Her voice was darkening with every word. "I think I understand you. You are not speaking from your own room." "What, from the office boot?" "Oh, then I understand you very well indeed." Neil looked about in alarm. It was time for her to stop. It was time to stop her, but how? The voice went on. "Play safe? Have you ever played anything else? You know, Frank, the truth is that you're a coward, a great hulking coward. Do you hear me? I want you to hear. You've got a safe thing at last. I should think safe and pasty. How much stock did you get with it? A big block, I hope. Now let me tell you the truth. I don't want you to come here. I never want to see you again, and while I live, and I forbid you to come and look at me when I'm dead. I don't want your hateful eyes to look at my dead face. Do you hear me? Why don't you answer me? Don't you dare hang up the receiver, you coward. Oh, you big... Frank, say something. Oh, he shut me off and I can't hear him." She flung the receiver down, dropped her head on the desk, and broke into heavy groaning sobs. Neil stood over her and waited with composure. For once he had been quick enough. He had saved her. The moment that quivering passion of hatred and wrong leaped into her voice, he had taken the big shears left by the tenor and cut the insulated wire behind the desk. Her reproaches had got no further than this room. When the sobs ceased, he touched her shoulder. He shook her, but there was no response. She was asleep, sunk in a heavy stupor. Her hands and face were so cold that he thought there could not be a drop of warm blood left in her body. He carried her into his room, cut off her drenched clothing, wrapped her in his bathrobe, and put her into his own bed. She was absolutely unconscious. He blew out the light, locked her in, and left the building, going as fast as he could to Judge Pomeroy's cottage. He roused his uncle and briefly explained the situation. "Can you dress and go down to the office for the rest of the night, Uncle Judge? Someone must be with her, and I'll get over to the captain at once. He certainly oughtn't to be left alone. If she could get across the bridge, I guess I can. By the way, she began talking wild, and I cut the telephone wire behind your desk. Keep an eye on it. It might make trouble on a stormy night like this. I'll get a livery hack and take Mrs. Forster home in the morning before the town is awake." When daylight began to break, Neil went to Captain Forrester's room and told him that his wife had been sent for the night to answer a long-distance telephone call, and that now he was going to bring her home. The captain lay propped up on 3 big pillows. Since his face had grown fat and relaxed, its ruggedness had changed into an almost Asiatic smoothness. He looked like a wise old Chinese mandarin as he lay listening to the young man's fantastic story with perfect composure, merely blinking and saying, "Thank you, Neil, thank you." As Neil went through the sleeping town on his way to the livery barn, he saw the short, plump figure of Mrs. Beasley, like a boiled pudding sewed up in a blue kimiko, wading through the feathery asparagus bed behind the telephone office. She had already been next door to tell her neighbor Molly Tucker, the seamstress, the story of the exciting night.